Okay, so we're going to move on to video number 2, and I'm going to pick up with the remaining questions. So for number 32, what I'm looking for here is I'm multiplying or dividing fractions. If we were to do this by hand, you would multiply across the top. 3 times 4 is 12. And you would multiply across the bottom. 8 times 8 is 64. But then we would have to reduce. I know that 4 goes into each one of these. 4 goes into 12 3 times. And 4 goes into 64 16 times. So I would have to think about how to reduce that. So that's why, once again, I'm going to suggest that we just do all of these on the calculator. So I have 3/8 times 4/8. Press enter, and then second, convert that to a fraction, and I get 3/16. And once again, if you feel more comfortable putting parentheses around your fraction, I definitely encourage that. So I'm going to move on to number 34. And one thing I should say about that before I move on is in number 32, I had a common denominator, but that's definitely not necessary when we're multiplying and dividing. We don't have to have common denominators. So with number 34, I'm going to use my parentheses. So I have 5 divided by 9. That was the first fraction. And then that's being multiplied by the second fraction, which is 7 divided by 4. And that, when I press enter, I get 0.9722. But if I'm looking for this as a fraction, I'm going to convert that to a fraction with my calculator, and I get 35 over 36. 35 over 36. And we can see if we would have just multiplied across the top, 7 times 5 is 35, and the bottom, 9 times 4 is 36. But like I said, we didn't have to worry about reducing. So if I were going to divide, when you divide a fraction by hand, you would just do keep, change, flip. So I keep the first one, 4 over 5. I change the division sign to a multiplication, and I flip the second fraction. So it's 5 over 2. And now if I multiply it across the top, 4 times 5 is 20. Across the bottom, I get 10. 20 divided by 10 is 2. Once again, we're just going to let the calculator do all that work for us. So I have 4 divided by 5. And then divided by 2 divided by 5. And I get 2. All right, so same thing I got when I did it by hand. So that's multiplying and dividing fractions. And then mixed numbers are a little bit tougher. I want my final answer as a mixed number, so we're going to use those same techniques that we learned when we were adding and subtracting mixed numbers. For number 38, I have 1 plus 3 divided by 8. That's 1 and 3/8, and then it's being multiplied by 2 and 5/6. So the way I would write that is 2 plus 5 divided by 6. So earlier I was saying that the parentheses are optional when we're dealing with fractions, then they are. But when we deal with mixed numbers and we're multiplying or adding mixed numbers, you have to have those parentheses around the whole mixed number. So 1 plus 3 divided by 8 is the same thing as 1 and 3/8. 2 plus 5 divided by 6 is the same thing as 2 and 5/6. So I'm going to press enter. And once again, I get this 3.89583. So my whole number is 3. All right. And now I just got to figure out how do I convert that decimal part to a fraction. So I'm going to subtract the whole number to get rid of it. And then I'm going to let the calculator turn that new decimal into a fraction, which is 43 over 48. So it's 3 and 43/48. All right, number 40. Just going to let the calculator do it. So I have 3 plus 5/12 times 1 plus 2/3. My whole number is 5. So then when I get rid of that whole number, I'm left with the decimal 0.6944, and I'm going to convert that to a fraction, and I get 25 over 36. So 5 and 25/36 would be my answer for that one. All right, let's go to the next section. So now we're dealing with word problems, and this is the way that we're going to see fractions a whole lot in this class. So if there are 600 people at a baseball game, there are 600 people at a baseball game. If 3/4 of them are pulling for the home team, how many total fans does the home team have at the game? So anytime that we're looking for a fraction of a whole, so the entire audience at the baseball game is 600, and I need to figure out what is 3/4 of 600. Anytime that that's your scenario, we're just going to multiply. So I have 3/4, and I'm going to multiply that by the total amount, and that gives me 450. So I have 450 fans at the game that are pulling for the home team. So once again, anytime that I'm looking for a fraction and I'm given the whole amount, so in this case I'm looking for what is 3/4 of 600, I just multiply 3/4 times 600, and that gives me 450. All right, 20 or 43 should be very similar. 44. This time I have Chelsea has determined that 1 out of 8 people, or 1/8 of the people attending the fair, will buy a hot dog. If there are 5,000 people attending the fair, how many of them will buy a hot dog? So here I'm looking for 1 out of 8 of the total. So I just want to think of that as a fraction, 1/8. And once again, I'm going to multiply that by the total amount of people that are attending the fair, which is 5,000. Press enter, and I get 625. So if 1 out of every 8 people buy a hot dog, and there are 5,000 people at the fair, then 625 people are going to buy a hot dog. And that's laid out very simply in number 45. I'm going to let you do this. But anytime I'm asking for what is a fraction of an entire amount, all we're doing is 1/4 times 500, and I'll let y'all answer 45, but that's the math behind it. All right. So in the remaining problems, we're going to be dealing with percentages. So starting with 46, I want to convert the decimal to a percentage. All we're going to do, if we're converting a decimal to a percentage, we move the decimal 2 times to the right. Now, some instructors will teach this multiply by 100. That's the same exact thing as moving the decimal place 2 times to the right. So I grab my decimal and I move it 2 times to the right. So my new decimal is here, so that gives me 25, and the decimal would be at the end, but we know we don't need to write the decimal if it's at the end, so it's just 25%. Same thing with 48. I need to grab that decimal, move it 2 times to the right. This time I had to add a 0 because I didn't have anything in that second spot to the right, so that would give me 30%. Number 50, I have 3.25. When I move that decimal 2 times to the right, I get 325, and my decimal would go at the end. Number 52, once again, I have a decimal and I want to move it 2 times to the right. So now my decimal is between the 3 and the 8, so it's just 3.8%. And sometimes I'll see students move the decimal but not write the percent sign. Whoops, sorry, that was supposed to be a highlighter. But not write the percent sign. If you move the decimal and don't write the percent sign, then you're changing the value of the number, right? So we want to move the decimal and add the percent sign to the end of it. So 1.067, I'm going to move it 2 times to the right. Sorry about that. So that gives me 106.7%. And that's how we would convert from a decimal to a percentage. So if we're starting with a percent and we're going to a decimal, we're going to do the exact opposite. We're going to move the decimal 2 times to the left. And these are going to start moving faster. So with number 56, I don't see my decimal. So the biggest question that I have is, where's the decimal at? The decimal is always behind the whole number. So this whole number is 30%. So the decimal would be behind 30. If you don't see it, that's where it's understood to be, behind the number. Not in front of the number, behind the number. So now if I grab that decimal and move it 2 times to the left, now my decimal is 0.30, which we could write as 0.3, or if you want to add a 0 in front of the decimal, you can. I think most people would write it 0.3. So same thing with my 2. If I move that 2 times to the left, I have to add this imaginary 0 there, so that's 0.2. If I want to add a 0 in front of my decimal, I can always add a 0 in front of my decimal. Number 60, once again, I'm still grabbing the decimal and moving it 2 times to the left. So I need to add another 0, so I have 0.0325. And once again, I said this when we were going from a decimal to a percent. A common mistake I'll see here is people will leave the percent sign, which would be completely incorrect. You don't want to leave the percent sign. When we move the decimal, we're changing it from a percent to a decimal. There is no more percent sign. 62, grab your decimal, 2 times to the left. That means I need to add a 0 here. So I have 0.00038. That's your answer. You can always add a 0 in front of the decimal if you want to. It's not necessary. 64, I have 456%, so my decimal would be at the end of that value, and then I move it 2 times to the left, which gives me 4.56. So 456% is the number 4.56. All right, last page, I believe. All right, so very similar to the word problems that we looked at the beginning of this video, here I'm just dealing with percentages. So if there are 600 people at the baseball game, once again, there are 600 people at the baseball game. If 20% of them are pulling for the home team, how many total fans does the home team have at the game? So just like when we had the fraction, if I want to find a percentage of a total, I'm going to multiply. So the math that I'm going to do is I first need to turn this into a decimal because your calculator doesn't have a percent. So we need to turn it into a decimal. So move that decimal 2 times, which gives me 0.20. And then you multiply that by the total amount. So 0.20 times 600. I'm going to grab my calculator. 0.20 times 600. Press enter, and I get 120. So that means I have 120 home fans at the game. All right, so 67 is very similar. 68, Chelsea has determined that 20% of people attending the fair will buy a hot dog. If there are 5,000 people attending the fair, how many of them will buy a hot dog? So once again, convert this to a decimal, and I use the same percentage here, but I think we got it. So that's 0.20 times the total amount times 5,000. So if I want to find out what is 20% of 5,000, once again, I'm converting that 20% to a decimal, 0.20. And I'm just multiplying it by the total amount of people, and in this case, that would be 5,000, and that gives me 1,000 people. So that is equal to 1,000 people will be buying a hot dog. So if I could simplify that as much as possible, anytime I'm asking to find a percent of an entire amount, I'm just taking the percentage, turning it into a decimal, so 15% would be 0.15, and then I'm multiplying it by 500. So 0.15 times 500 should be 75. That's how we would find a percent of a whole.